session of the IAS Symposium 2022. My name is Fabio Silva. I'm an assistant professor of international studies in the Wick, Cary professor of Brazilian studies here at OU, CIS, IAS. I'm chairing this panel that's going to start, as Scott mentioned in the morning, to unpack some case studies where we will try to better understand the nexus between corruption and authoritarianism. And I'm very glad to have here on this panel two of my two great friends and one friend that I've just been introduced to this week. Raquel Pimenta, professor from FGV São Paulo Law School, who is going to talk about Brazil. Mbongiseni Buthelezi, there's a little mistake in his his name tag there, but he's the executive director of the Public Affairs Research Group in South Africa, who is going to talk about that country. And Mohammad Qadam Shah, who is assistant professor at Seattle Pacific University, who is going to talk to us about Afghanistan. It might not be the best etiquette, but I'm going to be eating as I moderate this panel because I have a class to teach right after it, and I need to be fed for my students to get the best of me. We're going to start with Mohammad, who will speak for about 12 minutes, and then we will proceed with the others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you, Dr. Scott Whitson, for having me here. And I'm really also excited to be here because I've been reading and citing two of the greatest scholars working on corruption, Professor Johnston and Professor Klitgaard. And so it's really a privilege to be here and presenting here and talking about Afghanistan. So my topic, as you see, given the theme of the presentation, the symposium today, Authoritarianism and Corruption, so I'm going to look at how authoritarianism facilitated corruption and then how, in turn, it became a reason for the state failure in Afghanistan. So I think for most of you, Afghanistan, when we talk about Afghanistan, this is the first picture that may come up to your mind. The 9/11, that was when maybe most of you got to know about Afghanistan, and that became the focus of attention across the world. And since then, the U.S., as a reaction, as a response, they started to get into Afghanistan, and they started counter-terrorism operation that also included some level of estate building, liberal estate building, and nation building in Afghanistan. So it took around 20 years U.S. involvement in Afghanistan that became the longest war in the U.S. history and the most expensive liberal estate building across the world. After 20 years, the U.S. decided to withdraw from Afghanistan, and unfortunately, it coincided with the Taliban's second time takeover of Afghanistan. And immediately after that, you may have seen some of the tragic pictures and scenes from Afghanistan where thousands of Afghans rushed to the Kabul International Airport to get out and find a safe refuge for themselves and their families. This was the very last pictures that the people were just hanging on the wings of the airplane. So since then, August 2001, there's been this question why liberal estate building failed in Afghanistan. So the people, the policy makers, practitioners, they have been come up with different factors, reasons to explain that. U.S. withdrawal as the main factors because the political and financial support cut off, and then the government was not able to even stick around for 6 months, for 6 days. So the Afghan president fled the country. The neighbors' interference that's been a constant factor for a very long time in the Afghan history. Ethnic conflict, insufficient aid, culture. People were raising this question, maybe liberal democracy was not compatible with Afghanistan culture. So all of them, but what I'm going to focus today is not those factors, but I'm making this argument that wrong governance institutions facilitated an authoritarian regime, authoritarian system, and then it became a recipe for systemic corruption in Afghanistan. And ultimately, it gradually was working, and I think after 20 years, there was no trust existing between the Afghan government and the Afghan people, and the international community just simply lost their interest, and they had to leave. So with that, I'm going to look at kind of unpacking that argument, trying to explain how that happened. You know, in 2001, the international community came into Afghanistan with the hope of planting a liberal democracy in Afghanistan. And basically, the main argument behind that, as the theories of political science mention, highlight a lot, is that democratic countries are just not prone to conflict. They are going to be peaceful, coexisting with each other, and not only in the international level, but also at the national domestic level too. The government would be more responsible, responsive, and this core concept of good governance, in fact, was one of the goals that the international community were pursuing in Afghanistan. So since the beginning, it's been the argument I've been making for some time, but people were, I think, were just invested in the system, and they were assuming that there is liberal democracy happening in Afghanistan. But to me, and people who are thinking like me, it was an illusion of a liberal democracy in Afghanistan. So instead of creating the institutions that promote rule of law, accountability, responsible government, and all the basic fundamental ideals of liberal democracy, Afghanistan ended up with a system that it has inherited from the Soviet Union period in Afghanistan. So, the constitution that Afghanistan adopted in 2004 was in fact the readoption of the 1964 constitution that the Soviet Union at the time had a great influence in promoting that sort of ideals. So it was a very highly centralized system that was promoting top-down governance with a strong president that had the same prerogative or the powers that the king had in the 1964 constitution. So if you compare the two constitutions, you don't see any difference. Just the name of the king is taken out and the name of president is added there. So I can categorize his policies, his powers into political, fiscal, and administrative authorities. And I don't want to go in detail with all of them, but very major highlights of the president's power include his authority to appoint the ministers. He had the authority to appoint almost everyone at the central level and the local level. And when it comes to checks and balances and downward accountability, the system was designed for that sort of outcome, or it was set from the beginning to fail, because the electoral system for the parliament that was going to be the main check on the executive branch was really fragmented in the sense that there was a lot of independent candidates entering into the parliament, into the National Assembly in Afghanistan, and as a result of that, there was no party discipline. That is the fundamental core of the democracy. If there's no party discipline, then I think you cannot expect any opposition against the government. There would not be any coalition against the government to keep the government in check. So from the beginning, those institutions were designed in a way that was empowering the president to be in control of everything. And then the local participation was really weak. I can claim that there was the local population, the civil society had no venue to participate in the policy-making process and generally in the decision-making process. So as a result of that, there was a loose state-society relation in the sense that Afghanistan has a very strong society, meaning that if you go to the local, You see that the localities are so connected to each other, and they want to be engaged in the process, but the formal institutions, the government, the structure was not providing any venue for these people to participate. So as you can expect, it was a recipe for failure, and as we're talking about corruption, it was a recipe for systemic corruption. This is a formula that Professor Klitkar is providing: monopoly of the power, discretion, and lack of accountability. And as I mentioned, I summarized the system in one slide. You can imagine that the president has a lot of authority, and at the same time, there wasn't any check on him. So although the international community had some leverage on the president and the executive branch, but that wasn't translating the people's needs and preferences in the policies and every decisions made at the top level. So I'm going to, so based on that, I mean, you can imagine as I'm arguing, so this is an evidence from Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index from 2012 to 2021. So as you see, Afghanistan has been among the 3 most corrupt countries consistently during those years. So so I'm going now to just highlight some of the aspects of the failure in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, during the 20 years of U.S. investment in Afghanistan, did hold 3 presidential elections, and all of them very fraudulent and contentious. And the last two of them were the very highlight of those level of corruption. So you see on the left-hand side, that's Secretary of State John Cary, who had to come into Afghanistan and resolve the electoral dispute between the 2 presidential rivals. And then they formed the National Unity Government in 2014. And that was basically, the argument was that they have to share power, otherwise the country would go into civil war or civil conflict. Then after that, in 2019, there was no U.S. Secretary of State involved this time. Then again, the same scenario, the same 2 presidential candidates as you see. This time they had to inaugurate on the same day, on the same time in Afghanistan, because no one was agreeing with the results of the election. And one thing that I can signal here is that the level of the trust here between the government and the people, it's unbelievable that only 1.5 million people participated in the 2019 election. And half a million of those votes were declared as not good votes. So you can see that only 1 million people participated in the election, and that shows that the government has not been really performing well. So this is coming from the research that I did for my dissertation, looking at how the Afghan government was allocating the budget. So I looked at the political economy of budget allocation, and here is just a simple depiction of how the budget is allocated. So basically, the president considered the political criteria, like political relationship, political importance, and just a strength and weakness of the local power. Basically, the squeaky wheels could get greased in Afghanistan. So in terms of local participation, it is also a demonstration of that. So this is a percentage of the local needs or locally proposed development projects that were incorporated in the national budget. So the highest was 25%, and the lowest was 11%. So you can see how low the level of participation was. So after around 2007 or 2008, the government and international community noticed that the corruption is really soaring in Afghanistan, and they started to take some initiative. And this is a list of things that are happening and shows that the anti-corruption efforts were not really having any effect. So at the top, there was no political will to change because the system was working in the interest of the people on top. There was less pressure from the international donors. A lot of rules and regulations were adopted. Afghanistan adopted 18 laws and institutions to fight corruption, but none of them had any effect in practice. So the Anti-Corruption Commission was created without the involvement of the civil society. The president basically handpicked the member of that commission. Again, no downward accountability, and also the civil society was basically neutralized. So what future holds for Afghanistan? I'm not really optimistic, unlike you, Professor Johnston. So the thing is that Taliban are implementing the same system with some taste of Islamic extremism and fundamentalism. So you can expect that the result of this system would be worse than before. Corruption is soaring. I can hear from my family, from my friends, that services are more expensive now. A person to get a passport have to spend $5,000. And previously it was only $100, although they had to pay bribe still. So the prospects are not very clear. And finally, the problem in Afghanistan is not technical. The aid or the expertise are not the problem. The problem is political. The Afghans, with the diversity that we have to come up with a system that accommodate, at least at some level, this different ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups for the sake of stability and peace. That was all I wanted to say in this short period of time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mohammad. Now we're going to hear from Raquel. Just before I give you the floor, Raquel, I want to say, no, go ahead. Thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
I just want to say that I work with Raquel and Mbongiseni in a project that's called Project on Autocratic Legalism. Raquel actually coordinates that project with me and with another South African colleague, Liz Might. And that is a project where we studied the nexus, not between corruption and authoritarianism, but rather between authoritarianism and law. And we already have over 60 researchers working in this project, doing case studies on Brazil, India, and South Africa. But now we have a call for more contributors, which I took the liberty to leave in your tables. So if you happen to study those things, be in contact with us, submit your abstract, because we would love to work with more colleagues covering more countries. Thank you.
All right. So, yes, please do submit to Paolo. I want to start by thanking Professor Fritzen, Professor Desai Silva for the invitation to be here today. It's really a privilege. And today I wanted to share with you a few of my research work and my colleagues' work on what's happening now in contemporary Brazil in terms of the corruption as a tool of authoritarian governance. So it's not changing for me, but I can base myself there. Okay, so Jair Bolsonaro, a former congressman with little political expression, a long-standing supporter of the military dictatorship that ruled Brazil from 1964 to 1988, with an open rejection of civility and a lack of respect for human rights, galvanized anti-corruption and the anti-establishment sentiment to rise to power in Brazil in 2018 in his campaign. These feelings were already present in the public arena after years of the largest anti-corruption investigation ever seen in the country, car wash. The investigation managed to destabilize the political system, and bring many of the powerful corporations in the country to also down. No doubt Brazilians had that context in mind when they voted in 2018. Kim Shapley, in her seminar paper on autocratic legalism, argues that what makes this new strand of autocrats distinguishable these days is less his capacity of putting the tanks on the street, even though that happens everywhere, but his rise to power through the vote, but with a, quote, concerted and sustained attack on institutions whose job is to keep his actions in check, unquote. So this is the case of Bolsonaro. While he rose to power in a fairly democratic election, once in power, he has used 3 strategies to reshape, to concentrate power, as well to dismantle anti-corruption policies, which is what I want to discuss with you today. So reshaping the state market boundaries through governmental expenses, increasing opacity on his politics and policies by stretching interpretations of secrecy in the Brazilian access to information law, and dismantling anti-corruption institutions through the abusive use of his prerogative of chief of the executive to appoint key positions in agencies. But first, let me provide some background on our anti-corruption policies and the car wash investigations, and then turn to each one of these strategies. So the 1988 federal constitution that paved the ways to Brazil's return to democracy created components to hold the powerful to account. So transparency, independent institutions, and a political grammar that was able to sustain the commitment to democracy and due process. During the next 3 decades, institutions such as the federal police, the public prosecution office, the judiciary, the controllerships, and the audit courts created technical capabilities and political prestige, gained new instruments and competencies. However, in the country, it remained a lingering sense of impunity. Reasons on why impunity is such a magnet concept for Brazil may vary. Maybe it's because maturing institutions and instruments takes time. Maybe because political struggles really mobilized impunity in every election cycle. Maybe because conviction rates for white-collar crimes are still low. Then along came Lava Jato. The larger-than-life anti-corruption investigations that swept Brazil and Latin America in 2014 and ended in 2021. It was the result of these new and strengthened institutions, and it was animated by a particular idea of judges and prosecutors that impunity was an existential threat to the political system and to the economic system. Car Wash uncovered the pervasiveness of bribery, kickbacks, and backpatting between the state and companies through a combination of new tools and instruments that promoted better coordination between enforcement institutions. This is just to give you a somewhat example of how the scheme worked. The sophistication of the scheme and the numbers of the investigation are by any measures astounding. According through the years, the narratives of the investigations slowly shifted from a triumph over accountability over impunity to a much more hesitant account. This erosion was the result of contested legal strategies adopted by prosecutors and judges, abuses on the use of criminal law and pretrial detentions, and the open dispute of power among authorities. Judge Sérgio Moro, who presided the investigations for most of its time and ordered the imprisonment of former president and the Workers' Party candidate for the 2018 elections, Lula, eventually was himself considered by the Supreme Court as partial, and his rulings, at least in the Lula case, have been reversed. The end of the Lava Jato task force in the beginning of the 2021 was a reminder of the society's discomfort of living in the overlap between the reality of corruption that Lava Jato uncovered with the amounting evidence that the rule of law was, at times, weakened by the actions of those agents who should have protected it. Due to the particular ways that Jair Bolsonaro rose through power, he mobilized the anti-corruption feelings. He has been keen on declaring that ever since 2019, his first year of presidency, he has ended endemic corruption. Far from truth, now I want to look at the particular ways corruption have been enabled and furthered in his government. So, first of all, the Bolsonaro government attempted and succeeded in a way in reshaping the relations between the market and the state especially to cater to interests dedicated to keep him in power and embed his political project. The Bolsonaro government has used corporativist tools to attend the interests of the military personnel, for instance, excluding them from stringent pensions reforms and reinforced policies of tax benefits to conservative groups. More importantly, he has deployed relevant portions of the national budget through lax budget provisions to manage its allies in Congress, the so-called secret budget. These federal investments have been used to buy trucks, build roads through completely opaque proceedings. Today, the so-called secret budget represent almost 25% of all discretionary investments made by the federal government. One pressing question here is not only how these expenses represent a new tool of co-opting the legislative by giving them resources with unchecked power, but also how it's reshaping the private partners interested in these contracts and investments in the local level. In a new working paper, I argue that opacity and arbitrariness in these spendings lead to an institutional erosion of the market, favoring private players that would not qualify otherwise. So in that sense, we're watching this further degradation of state-market relationships. So our Access of Information Law, signed in 2019, is one of the key instruments of institutional building of an accountability system in Brazil. It is praised to be a comprehensive law that has established transparency as the rule for governmental acts, with few exceptions for secrecy. Bolsonaro has attempted to change the law through decrees, but most of his actions were reverted by the judiciary. Then the government turned to the expansion of the interpretation of secrecies. So studies show that while the level of governmental responses to FOIA requests have remained the same throughout the Bolsonaro government, the quality of answers, and especially the increased use of these exceptions for secrecy, have changed the nature of transparency in the country. In a systematic recollection of the use of secrecy, we show qualitative differences in at least 4 topics. 1, the personal relations of the president, so declaring secrecies on his son's visits to the official house, on his vaccination documents, on the visits of his personal friends to the official buildings. 2nd, foreclosing access to public policy data and policy choices. So secrecy declared on deforestation rates, on data used to base the country's pension reform, even secrecy on public studies on the existence or not of an epidemic of drugs in the country. And also all coupled with the dismantling institutions that produce such data, such as the official data agency or agencies in charge of monitoring Amazon deforestation. 3, clamping down access of civil society and the press to data. So giving this shallow interpretation of secrecy to avoid delivering data and extinguishing participatory committees that would review these data and policies. And 4, increasing the levels of secrecy on military and armed forces businesses. This, of course, military and armed forces have a legal provision for secrecy due to national security concerns, but we have seen an expansion of that use throughout the Bolsonaro government. And so finally, Bolsonaro's tactics for establishing corruption maybe as an authoritarian governance were coupled with weakening anti-corruption policies, basically with the strategic use of the executive's prerogative to appoint key figures for positions. First, through reorganizing the agencies and nominations within the executive. So Bolsonaro has changed individuals at key posts at the Federal Revenue Service, responsible for cooperating and sharing information with other law enforcers, once they started investigating his son, a Brazilian senator, for corruption and money laundering. Related to the same investigations, his government also fired the head of the Brazilian Financial Intelligence Unit and reallocated the agency within the executive. Second, by using his prerogative for nominating the head of independent control institutions, such as the Prosecutor General or the Attorney General. So, since 2003, presidents used to pick a name for the Prosecutor General from a short list presented by the prosecutors themselves. This was an informal practice that potentially guaranteed that the Prosecutor General would first attend to the interests of prosecutors that had put him or her in that short list, rather than only relying on the chief of the executive for alliances. The president's decision to circumvent this practice was seen as a way of weakening the prosecution service independence from the executive, which is particularly important because the Prosecutor General has the attribution of investigating the president and his ministers, as well as members of the House and the Senate. Similar patterns of attempting to co-opt the apex of controlled institutions were also seen in the nominations of the general attorney. And as a result, we already have research showing that Bolsonaro's government and policies have received the lowest level of contestation in courts since redemocratization, effectively shielding them from judicial accountability. I want to conclude with one final remark. We're in the middle of a new campaign, or a presidential campaign in Brazil, and we may see Bolsonaro defeated. However, there are many lessons to be learned in the about these last 4 years. While it took us over 30 years of incremental institutional building since returning to democracy, these last years were impressive in the depth of institutional erosion in any topic, and particularly on corruption. Supposing we have a change of government, our next chapters will be conditioned by this one. The institutional landscape is different, and the tasks ahead will also be diverse. Comparative analysis and the precise exercise we're doing today, confronting experiences and tactics, may be exactly the best way to think ahead, while distilling some lessons. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel. I want to take advantage again of the captive audience to thank Stephanie Sager and Loami Rodriguez for the work that they did for the symposium. If everything is running so smoothly, it's because of their hard work, so thank you. Mbongiseni.
Thank you. I also want to echo what has been said by my colleagues. My thanks to Scott, to Fabio, of course, and echo the thanks that Fabio has just expressed for being here. I think it's a great conversation, and I'm pleased to be part of it. So I have titled my remarks 9 Wasted Years, with a question mark, Democratic South Africa's Near Undoing. And I'm looking at the period 2009 to 2018. I think in the case of South Africa, we think we've dodged a bullet, but we don't know yet. We're not out of the woods yet. And that's because of what happened in this period, 2009 to 2018. So I think the first thing maybe is to go back, similarly, I think, to Raquel, and talk a little bit about, the backdrop to this period, 2009 to 2018. So South Africa is a relatively new democracy in many ways. We became a democracy only in 1994, after, what some might call 300, 400 years of colonial rule, of white minority rule. And that transition, I think, though, cast the die, the transition to democracy, cast the die on some of what we've come to see in more recent years. What happened in the period I'm talking about, 2009 to 2018, I think is that the democracy in South Africa had consolidated enough to be able to withstand an assault that we saw in that period. What do I mean by that? I think some of the institutions that we had in the country were quite strong and helped us dodge this bullet I'm talking about. So a pretty strong judiciary, an independent judiciary, a pretty strong and independent media, as well as political opposition parties that are, well, not particularly strong, but sufficiently strong to be able to withstand the assault on the democratic project that we saw. But the other key player that is, I think, quite strong is civil society. And I speak in part as the Public Affairs Research Institute that I run was a player in what in the story that I'm talking about. And we consider ourselves an academic project, but one that's very much based in civil society. So the 9 wasted years, what are we talking about? We're talking about what has been described. The picture you see there, it's an image of the current president in South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who became president after the removal, the resignation of his predecessor, Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma got removed after a concerted campaign that we were involved in, that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And the campaign, it was generally called Zuma Must Fall, or Zuma Must Go. It came about really because of what you see in that image, which is fantastic. The detritus of the Zuma years that has spilled over into the current, or into the current administration, which is why I said earlier, we think we have dodged a bullet, but it's uncertain whether we have just yet. The detritus really is of massive corruption that we saw in that period. It's corruption that has, I think, precedents much further back in the transition to democracy. But other people argue it goes even further back, of course. That what the democratic government of 1994 inherited was a fundamentally corrupt system of government, fundamentally corrupted state-owned companies, and some people, Henny van Vuren and others, in another organization called Open Secrets, have traced this back to the 1970s. But what happens in the 1990s and in the transition to democracy is really the first major corruption scandal in South Africa happens in 1999. 1999, what happens is there's a massive arms acquisition project where arms traders that had been trading with the apartheid government, that had been circumventing the embargo on the arms trade with South Africa, that had massively corrupted the apartheid army in South Africa, just remade themselves and started trading with the post-apartheid government. It was the same players, actually, that were selling arms to the post-apartheid government. And that major corruption scandal of 1999 is really the moment where the loss of innocence happens. And I think the die is cast from that moment, where there begins to be a gradual creeping of corruption into just becoming the order of business in the way that the African National Congress-led government was operating. But this reaches its zenith in the Zuma years. Now, Jacob Zuma gets elected into office initially as president of the African National Congress, and 2 years later as president of the country. So in 2007, he becomes ANC president. 2009, he becomes president of the country. But in the period between his election as president of the ANC, 2007, his predecessor, Thabo Mbeki, gets removed. There's an interim president, and it's at that point, in 2008, that really Jacob Zuma begins to sink his claws into the presidency. From 2009, then we see this acceleration of corruption, what has come to be termed state capture in South Africa. State capture, I think, elaborating, and it gets elaborated in a report that we were involved in publishing a few years later, elaborating on Joel Hellman and Daniel Kaufman's theory of state capture in transition societies that had been developed to talk about Eastern Europe. But in South Africa, it comes to take on a particular meaning, which in fact, we've elaborated in a book that I just sent to the press last week on this episode in South Africa. And part of this is enabled by a blurring of the distinction between state and party in South Africa. It goes way back. There's a progressive deterioration of state institutions, particularly when it comes to the executive arm of the state, but also when it comes to the bureaucracy. What happens in the Zuma years is what we've argued is the development of a shadow state. And this is an argument in a report called A Betrayal of the Promise, How South Africa is Being Stolen, which we published in 2017 as part of a group called the State Capacity Research Group that was part of sort of the analysis that was helping to push back against the corruption of the Zuma presidency. The modus operandi of the corruption that develops and the development of this shadow state, the way it operated was, some of the features of it, not all, was really the capture of state-owned companies, the reorganization of governance of those companies by simply replacing members of boards with compliant people who were part of this network of corruption, and then bypassing the rules, of course. I mean, we've got in South Africa, in paper at least, very strong anti-corruption laws, very strong procurement laws. But those procurement laws were simply bypassed by these people that had been put on those boards in order to favor particular networks and siphon off huge sums of money into the coffers of those networks. That money, of course, was then laundered out of the country. We traced most of that money to Hong Kong, and it ended up in Dubai. Some of it has then filtered back into South Africa to run a campaign to fight against this pushback that we had launched against state capture. The other element that was quite critical was that the hollowing out of key state institutions that should have been investigating, should have been prosecuting some of the crimes that we saw in this period. Some of those institutions, of course, include the police service, the prosecution services, that were hollowed out in a similar, I think, process to what Raquel was talking about, where the president used the prerogative to appoint the directors of those institutions, to appoint people who were pliable, or to appoint people who themselves had skeletons in their closets, and therefore should themselves have been investigated and prosecuted. And what they did was to actually stop a whole lot of the investigations that were taking place, especially against, of course, the Gupta family. So the people at the center of this that were working with the then president was this family of Indian emigres, the Guptas. There's 3 brothers who had arrived in South Africa in 1993. And they were the key drivers, really, of this project. They've since fled to South Africa and ended up in Dubai. There's an attempt to try and extradite them to South Africa now. They are sitting, 2 of them are sitting in a Dubai jail, waiting for the extradition process to South Africa. The saving grace in all of this was some of the state institutions that really stood strong against this. So this report, published in 2017 actually, was out of the Office of the Public Protector. And the then Public Protector had launched an investigation where other agencies had failed. For example, the intelligence agencies, as far back as 2011, had tried to investigate the Gupta brothers. President Zuma at the time had actually forced the 3 directors of the South African, of the intelligence agency that had been trying to launch this investigation out, and had replaced them with more pliable people. The public protector, who at that time her term of office was coming to an end, rushed an investigation through that really began to be the turning point, and published this report just as her term of office was coming to an end. So Thuli Madonsela, who remained independent, fiercely independent in the face of assaults on her office and attempts to remove her by the president, really opened the door for this to happen. Launched this report and then left office. One of the recommendations of this report was that the president needed to appoint a commission of inquiry into state capture, but the president could not, and this was really a critical move on the part of the public protector. The president could not appoint the presiding judge. It had to be left to the Chief Justice of the country. And the Chief Justice chose his deputy, Judge Zondo. That commission, which ran for 5 years, just concluded a few months ago. And last week, we co-hosted with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution a conference on the findings and the recommendations of that commission. We've now been asked to help the presidency, in fact, write a submission to Parliament on how it's going to implement the recommendations of that commission. And so that's how we came to dodge the bullet. There was massive civil society mobilization against Jacob Zuma, and we had the slides are not moving now. There's a fantastic picture, and the last picture I wanted to show you. It was of massive crowds in 2017, 2018 that were mobilized onto the streets. It was the biggest set of marches with the biggest numbers of participants that we'd seen in South Africa since the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s and 90s, that we were able to mobilize through really launching an argument that South Africa was being stolen and the democratic project was in danger of being undone. People got out onto the streets. We were able to ultimately, between those mobilizations by civil society, by political parties, by trade unions, but also through growing discontent within the ruling party with that president, who had actually survived motions of no confidence. He had survived 8 motions of no confidence in Parliament up to that point. He was facing a 9th motion of no confidence, and members of his own party had eventually turned against him. There have been litigation, reports like this had shown the extent of the rot that had set in, and we think he was going to lose that last motion of no confidence, and in the end decided to resign and leave. Where to from here? I think we can talk about that in discussion. We think the tentacles of corruption reach so deep in the country that even though the current president ran on a ticket of anti-corruption, it's been shown in more recent times, and we thought he himself might be removed by the end of this year, that he has been involved in some forms of corruption as well, because of how corrupted the political system has become in the country. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay, I don't have any other message, so we can go straight to the questions and answers. Who goes first? Stephanie and Loami are going to be circulating with the mics to get your questions.
So I was waiting for somebody else to start, but nobody did. So, but all of you here, all you students, think about something. It's your turn to ask a question. I'll ask a question, but this should go to you guys. One of the themes that I heard, first of all, thank you. That was very, very interesting. I really, I learned a lot from those. Even though they were brief presentations, they were very interesting. One theme is the role of institutions. And so I have different questions for each of you that have to do with that. In the case of Afghanistan, I'm sympathetic to the argument that institutions performed poorly and were co-responsible for the collapse of the state. Is there any evidence that different institutions would have done better? That's my question. In the case of Brazil, I puzzle about how to interpret recent history. Were the institutions bad because so much corruption went unnoticed or unprosecuted for so long? Were they good because they did finally start prosecuting and many, many important people were prosecuted appropriately? Or were they bad because they inappropriately prosecuted some people? And in the case of South Africa, what I heard, and I don't know the case, so I may have misunderstood, was that what really made a difference was civil society, not political institutions of the state. And I wonder what that means about fighting corruption and the role of institutions. So just some questions.
So I think with regard to Afghanistan, there is the history of Afghanistan shows that it has had a very strong society in the sense that there's been a lot of informal institutions existing in Afghanistan. So I can make an example of that. In 1747, Afghanistan was formed, and then until 1880, Afghanistan was in fact a confederate state, where the regions were just coexisting with each other. And then in 1837, that was the period that Great Britain came into Afghanistan out of its interest to use Afghanistan as a buffer zone against Russia at the time that the two empires were expanding at that time. So that was, I think, the rupture that happened in the Afghan history. And that was the moment that Afghanistan deviated from its natural course of development or state formation. That's very common among the African colonies, the Asian colonies, or Latin American colonies. So to answer to your question simply and briefly, yes, there are alternative institutions in Afghanistan that should have been adopted in 2001, but unfortunately the U.S., it is very typical in the liberal state building that when you come in, you're going to do two things, either to create new institutions or reform the institutions so that they match the local needs, right? The institution should be designed in a way that respond or kind of reflect the local realities and local conditions. So I think with Afghanistan, that was a mistake that the U.S. made. And instead of going back and learning from the history and relying on the existing informal institutions, they just relied on the institutions that the Soviet Union started to plant in 1950s. And then if you look at the constitution, it's just the same constitution as 1964. So a more decentralized, I would say, a police-centric system would be more reflective of the realities in Afghanistan rather than a centralized system that gives a lot of power and authority to the president to single-handedly kind of control the state. And I found it ridiculous, the president, to call himself very hard-working, working for 18 hours, micromanaging everything. And he was just proud of that. But for me, governance is not, it shouldn't happen like that. Yes, the president should be active, working a lot, but you cannot really manage everything by yourself. You have to devolve the power and include the society in the process.
Thank you so much for your question. I think it's a very complex one. I think Brazil's recent history shows that the struggle for accountability and for institutional building is very complex. I wouldn't frame it as bad or good institutions, because I think it's much more than that. In the sense that we're making institutions the equivalent of organizations, I don't think we can say that, the story depicts the whole history of the prosecution service or the judiciary or even of what's happening right now. I was just trying to discuss specific episodes that these institutions were involved in. And I think we should look at those as a learning process. In the end, so if in your very provocative question, the good provocations that academia brings us, I guess, if the institutions were bad because they prosecuted either not fully or wrongly, or I think the answer is we really need to look at those and bring back the learnings we had in those cases back to those institutions, in the sense that if we have two dilemmas in the overlap in Brazil. If we don't prosecute and punish corrupt acts, well, we have impunity. But if we prosecute and punish acts wrongly or without respect of due process, they will weaken those same institutions in the long run. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for that question. So I think the short answer is, in South Africa, it was civil society and a whole lot of other players that made a difference. I don't think civil society on its own would have been as effective as the whole set of processes taken together were able to be effective. I'll come back to a description of how civil society played out. Let me just describe the players. So I think one thing that was very helpful was there were a lot of cases brought before the courts that exposed the depth, but also the forms of corruption that were taking place. And those cases were brought by civil society organizations to some extent, but also by opposition political parties. Opposition parties, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the Democratic Alliance brought a lot of cases against different parts of government, different parts of the state to court. The independence of the courts, even in the face of attempting to corrupt them. I mean, we don't yet know fully, but there are indications that the commission that has just concluded began to point to how there are attempts to bribe certain judges, and certain judges may have been bribed. Evidence has not come out fully just yet. So I think the courts played a very significant role, opposition parties and civil society bringing those cases to court. The media, and especially, I think, the independence of that media, again in the face of an assault on newsrooms being eroded, being underfunded, etc., in the age of the growth of social media. But we had enough investigative journalism that, again, held quite firm and exposed a lot of what was going on under the Zuma presidency. So I think that taken together with the role that was played by mobilization on the streets, those things, I think, worked in tandem. The other element which I didn't talk much about was that in Parliament, I talked about the motions of no confidence, but Parliament has also progressively been weakened in South Africa over the years, and that is partly because of the power of the governing party. So if you go back to the 1994, the Mandela years, we had a really strong Parliament that was holding the executive accountable. But over time, what has happened is that the ruling party, members of Parliament, answer to their party more than to the electorate. And that's partly the function of the electoral system that we have in the country, which we at the moment, there's work being done to try and reform that system. There's been a judgment in the courts that said that system needs to be reformed for independent candidates to be able to run in elections. And the commission, in fact, recommends that the president needs to be elected directly. We'll see how far those reforms go. But the weakness of Parliament meant that Zuma survived, of course, those 8 motions of no confidence because he was able to manipulate who gets appointed into the parliamentary seats on the side of the African National Congress. And the opposition is not strong enough, right? The ruling party has a sufficient majority. It was able to withstand any motions of no confidence brought by the opposition against Zuma. They just give a line of march to their MPs and they'd all go and vote against all of those motions of no confidence. But that began to change. I think the exposés over time and the building of the evidence that took place, the fragmentation of the ruling party itself, which has factionalized quite seriously, meant that there were enough MPs that would vote with the opposition in 2017. And it became clear, I think, to Mr. Zuma that he was going to lose and be removed. On civil society, I mean, the story also is quite complex going back to the 1990s, in that civil society was regrouping, I think, in this moment in some ways. In the 1990s, coming out of apartheid, I mean, we had a really, really mobilized and very strong anti-apartheid movement that through the 1980s, even though organizations were banned, had been able to just mobilize people on a mass scale. In the 1990s, we begin to see a demobilization of that civil society because also naively, I think people thought we were all pulling in the same direction. People who had been anti-apartheid activists went into the state and became state functionaries. That began in the early 2000s to be a change, when the Treatment Action Campaign was fighting the then president, Thabo Mbeki, to provide antiretroviral drugs, and began taking government to court for the first time on a major scale in the post-apartheid period. Civil society, the relationship between civil society and the state also began to change and to shift. But from about 2010, there's a whole set of organizations, including my organization that I formed in 2010, that are for the most part run by people who were not part of that anti-apartheid movement, who begin to take a very different, build a very different relationship with the state, begin to be much more critical of the state and much more adversarial towards the state. And that's what, that part of civil society had not been able to mobilize numbers until this moment in 2016, 17, 18, on the back, I think, in part, of a student movement, the Fees Must Fall movement of 2015, 2016, that had also really began to mobilize younger people who got involved in this fight against this corruption.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Any other question? We still have time for questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. So I have a question from Dr. Qadam Shah. So you mentioned about the decentralized or polycentric system for Afghanistan as an alternative, like previous highly centralized liberal government. So as an example, like, can you give us some countries like US as a federal government, or that like our neighboring country Pakistan is also, they have a federal government. Do you think that those examples can be like not a quick copy-paste solution, but like as source of inspiration for us for government building, or we should have our own version of like decentralized country? Second, like, is a follow-up for that. So if the solution like doesn't work for us, so the countries like have went through this failure state process. Like, how other countries like see this example of Afghanistan and use the experience that they have like in the past 20 years to avoid such mistakes? Thank you very much.
Yes, I think.
Do you mind if we take another question,
yes,
and then we get back to the three of you to respond? And I guess that would be the final round.
Is that working? Okay, it's on. Thank you, and thank you all to the panelists. And my question actually fits with the previous one, and also with Dr. Kenny's question very nicely. So I look forward to hearing the answer. So what we've heard from the panelists is a series of instances of inadequate institutions to support democracy, but also then of cases in which democratic institutions have been ignored by political actors, have been overridden by political actors, have been captured by political actors both within the state and outside the state. So zooming out for a second to kind of the world historical period that we're living in, and sort of looking at lessons across societies. The previous question was about the United States. Let's be honest, we face a situation in the United States where there are actors who are bypassing, ignoring checks and balances, ignoring institutions, seeking to capture institutions in ways that undermine the democratic process. So my question is, what lessons might there be in a world in which, I hope many people will be here for the afternoon session. I'm going to be talking about Hungary. It's another case where a democratically elected government has subverted all of the institutions and captured the system that way, even though the institutions themselves look very sound, or they once looked very sound. What are the lessons for democracy and for saving democracy when the lessons for political actors are that you can actually capture democratic institutions and bypass democratic institutions and ignore democratic institutions as a path to power, even in a democratic system?
Yeah.
Thanks.
And even federalism that Mohammad was advocating should be a solution for Afghanistan, right? There's this important expression that was used to describe U.S. federalism, that it would be a laboratory for democracy. We are now seeing federalism in the country becoming a laboratory for autocracy, because it's in state governments that the anti-democratic policies and solutions are being cooked up. So it's really puzzling. I'll let the panelists address the questions that they want, and then we'll finish.
I think immediately, as a short response to that, I think there is this tendency among the politicians that they are rational, they are self-interested, and if you look at it from political economy perspective, there is always this challenge of restricting or limiting the powers of the people who are in power. So I think looking at the U.S. and the challenges that democracy, U.S. as the major democratic model across the world, I think the institutions need to be evolving, in the sense that the institutions that has been working in the U.S. for so long, now it is starting to be appearing as weak or not enough in order to restrict or keep the power holders in check. I think that's something that comes to my mind, and that comes from what Thomas Jefferson has been talking about. The institution should have that evolving nature, so that based on time and the exigencies of the time, I think those institutions need to be reformed, and some changes would be needed. I'm not suggesting another constitutional amendment for the U.S., but I think the whole country should be concerned about these issues, and I think some ways to ensure that the institutions of democracy can ensure that constraints and limitation over the power of the politicians. And I think that applies for all the countries, and that's a constant threat. So authoritarian is a separate case where the individual politicians have the power and they are using the laws in their favor in order to impose their will and use the system for their interest. So that's one thing for as a short answer for that question. And in response to the other question, I think with regard to Afghanistan, Afghanistan could look at different examples, like Pakistan or India or Indonesia. I think was a very interesting example where the politicians were very strong, and especially the tribal leaders were very strong. And what Indonesia did was giving the provincial leadership to those tribal leaders and keeping them in check, and then they decentralized below the provincial level. I'm not saying that that would be a good model, because adapting and then copying and pasting would have its own challenges and problems. And interestingly, we did a survey on Afghanistan, and we came up with this question, because when we were talking about federalism, if you raise that in Afghanistan even now, especially the Taliban, they would say that federalism would lead us into disintegration, and then each ethnic group, each province would declare their independence, and then it's very difficult to unite the country, right? So this became a question for us, and we ran a survey, and we asked, the number was not very big, but we at least reached to 2,500 Afghans from different levels of education, different occupation, from men, women, every group. And interestingly, instead of asking them whether federalism is good for Afghanistan or not, or decentralization or centralization, pick one of them, we gave them the institutions of the governance. Instead of asking this binary question, we told them, what's the best way the governor to be elected? Do you want the governor to be elected, or you want the central government to appoint the governor? Do you want, what kind of role the provincial councils should have? Should they be engaged in the budgeting, kind of deciding what kind of development projects you need, or you need the central government to decide on your behalf? Interestingly, majority of the Afghans of that group, the respondents said that they are in favor of those institutions. We didn't give them the name because it comes with that negative politicized connotation that it would lead us into disintegration. And Afghans historically have not been in favor of cessation or disintegration. That was one of the questions we asked, and they, interestingly, they want to be united. And even if you listen to the leaders from different ethnic groups, they're not raising this point that they want to be seceded, they want to have their own, or North Afghanistan, South Afghanistan. So that's one thing. And the other question you answered about what lessons the world can learn from Afghanistan, I think that is the mistake that state builders have been making in different countries. I think transformation, reforming is good, but it should be based on the local needs and preferences. If there is a distance between what the people want and desire with the institutions that they get, it will be a problem. There will be a problem. I can see the examples of that in the U.S. So you can see there is this argument, there is some divisions, but I think, again, those institutions need to be reflective of the people. Thank you.
Beautiful.
So regarding the lessons for the advancement of democracy in those very complicated times we're living in, so I think the most important lesson we already have is that it should not be taken for granted. The third wave of democratization was supposed to be the end of history in a way. Every country would naturally gravitate towards democracy, and it doesn't. But just addressing the large crowd of students in the room, I think there are at least 4 areas of study we should at least focus on to draw lessons from. One is institutions, as Professor Shah has emphasized in his lecture. Second is mobilization, which Professor Buthelezi has talked a lot about in South Africa, and the civil society and institutions nexus. Third, maybe the political economy that sustains these governments, the markets, the connections that markets and states have to sustain these new autocrats or these wannabe autocrats in power. And fourth, something that we really should look at is the local and transnational alliances that we are seeing. So we're seeing these new alliances, these new extreme right-wing alliances globally. So Orban talks to Bolsonaro, who talks to other extremist leaders. But also the other way around is also very important. Pro-democracy mobilization taking to the international spheres, pro-environmental policies taken in the international spheres. So this local transnational connection is also an important place to look for lessons. Yeah.
I'll be brief because I know you have to run. But also what I wanted to say has been said pretty much. But I think the world historical moment really has made it clear to us that institutions are contingent, right? And they're provisional. And the price to pay to sustain those is eternal vigilance. So I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Our next session is at 3? 3 o'clock? Okay. So I invite you all to come back. Yeah, there's going to be more cookies or, there's going to be some food.